88.1 KFCF in Fresno.
Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. Jeff Fawcett and I come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health and the environment.
I talk to myself a lot, mostly in my mind, but sometimes it won't stay in and I'll catch myself talking out loud, although I've been socialized enough so I avoid doing anything too alarming. A friend of mine referred to it as chatter. So it came as quite a revelation when I heard a radio program about the research being done about the phenomenon of inner speech. Who talks to him or herself? Not everyone. How often? It varies widely. What about? Anything you can imagine. The research mentions that a common thing people do with inner speech is rehearse conversations and other dialogues. I never thought of it, but it was one of the revelations. In plain sight, or I guess I should say in plain hearing, but I hadn't recognized what I was doing. Odd but true. Another revelation was that the study of talking to yourself began in the early years of the Soviet Union, how it was ignored with the rise of behaviorist psychology, but is now receiving reinvigorated attention, that it has intimately to do with how children develop as social beings, how inner speech is related to the phenomenon of hearing voices, whether a clinical condition or as an ecstatic experience, and the role it plays in creating and maintaining your sense of yourself. It even challenges the idea that there is such a thing as the unitary self. My guest today is Charles Fernyhough, Ph.D., author of The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves. He originated and leads the interdisciplinary project Hearing the Voices that works to better understand the experience of hearing voices from different academic perspectives and works with voice hearers, clinicians, and mental health professionals. Charles Fernyhough, welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on the show.
When I was reading through your book, I told a friend about it, described what your book was about, The Voices Within. She said, I don't do that. I don't talk to myself. And the next day she said, I guess I do talk to myself. How common is that as a reaction to this topic, to this issue? And how ordinary is inner speech?
I'm interested in whether your friend was referring to speaking to herself out loud or internally or silently in the head.
Internally, talking in the head. And I was remarking to her the coverage of the kind of ordinary thing that I've noticed in myself forever of that, as opposed to, which I will want to talk to you about, the phenomenon of hearing voices.
Sure. When I started working on this topic of inner speech, I think I probably assumed that because, probably extrapolating from my own experience, I do a lot of inner speech. So I think I probably assumed that everybody did a lot. And one of the things I've learned is that it's just not true. That a lot of people do a lot of inner speech, but not everybody does it. There are some people that I've worked with who really don't do very much of it at all. So I think there's a danger in thinking that it's some kind of universal part of our experience. I think it's a common thing that we do a lot of, and I think that's because it's useful. But it's definitely not universal. It's definitely not something that everybody does.
Is her reaction an unusual one? Are people surprised to find out that they are talking to themselves internally?
I think your friend's case is quite unusual, but what it also nicely illustrates is how hard it is to know what goes on in our experience. And it's the fact that your friend changed her mind that I think is particularly interesting. It is incredibly difficult to become aware of our own inner experience, which sounds odd, it sounds paradoxical, it sounds nonsensical, because how can it be difficult to know what's in your own mind? But actually, I think it is difficult in all sorts of ways. It's very difficult to report on it. It's very difficult to keep track of it. So when people are not unsure or when people change their mind about things, it doesn't really surprise me.
One of the very interesting things about your book that you discuss is that there's this ordinary sense of just talking to yourself internally and inside your head. And then there's the phenomenon of hearing voices, which in your work shows up in two areas. One, I would call it a therapeutic or clinical context in which, for instance, what your work has to say about auditory hallucinations and the relationship of that to conditions such as schizophrenia, diagnosed schizophrenia. But the other is that you've very poignantly described ecstatic experiences or religious experiences where the voices being heard are not compelling someone or tormenting someone, but are, in some cases, literally the voice of God. So dividing the phenomenon up into two, one the hearing of voices, one the just talking to yourself, call it. What do we know about what causes those two phenomena to happen?
On the surface of it, this everyday, almost but not quite universal phenomenon of talking to oneself silently in one's head seems very different to particularly the kind of stereotyped view of someone who's hearing voices or having, as you say, auditory verbal hallucinations, which we usually associate with severe mental illness. So something like 70% of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia will hear voices. And on the surface, these things seem quite hard to reconcile, but at the same time, they do have things in common. That, you know, the voices, the ordinary voices in our heads speak in language. They speak in language which gets changed and transformed in various ways. They often give commands. We use our inner speech to regulate ourselves. So there are these interesting resonances with the more unusual and very often distressing and debilitating experiences of hearing voices. But one of the things I would emphasize is variability. Both ordinary inner speech and hearing voices are incredibly varied phenomena. So a couple of things to point out about what you mentioned. It's not the case that all voices in terms of hallucinations are commanding. Some are, but they're in a minority. Very often, voices are doing something quite different. Voices, even for people who have a psychiatric diagnosis, voices can be positive as well as being negative, and they can be pretty neutral. I mean, it's quite often that voices start in a really banal kind of just commenting on one's own actions, and they can, of course, turn really nasty as well. So I think it's really important to remember that those two groups of experience, inner speech and voices, are really varied. But having said that, there's a very simple theory that links the two. And that is that when somebody hears a voice, what is actually happening is that they're talking to themselves. But for some reason, that individual's brain cognitive system doesn't recognize that speech that was produced as having been produced by that individual. So it is experienced as coming from elsewhere, not necessarily physically from another location, but not being of the self. And that leads to this very, can be frightening and very debilitating experience of having this voice in your head that doesn't feel like it's your own. And there are various reasons why, or that are postulated about why someone might misinterpret their own inner speech in this way, to not recognize their own inner speech in this way. There's a neat little neuroscientific account of why it happens. Essentially, the idea is that the part of your brain that produces language usually sends a little internal signal to the part of your brain that processes language, that understands language. And the idea goes, and there's some evidence for this, that in the case of hallucinations, that little internal message doesn't get through. It either doesn't happen at all, or it's degraded, or it's delayed in some way. So that bit of the brain that is recognizing language doesn't get the usual message that this is actually your own work. This is something that you yourself are saying. And so this leads to this uncanny experience of this alien voice in the head. Now, as I say, it's a neat theory. It's a nice simple theory, and simple theories are good because they're easy to test, and this one has had a fair bit of support, but there are also a lot of problems with it, and not least the fact that many people who hear voices don't like this theory because they feel that the voices that are in some cases tormenting them really are not themselves speaking. I've heard people say, it can't be my own voice because it's saying such horrible things, and that's a puzzle, that's a conundrum. I think it gets easier to understand when we recognise that our inner speech is actually a very varied thing and that we don't actually know our own inner speech all that well. So part of the mystery for me has been about trying to understand the regular inner speech better, because that will give us a better chance of working out whether this inner speech theory of voices is a good theory or not.
There's a aspect to sports medicine or sports training. It's called self-talk, that there's been discussions about how we coach ourselves, how someone will talk themselves up to perform some athletic thing. And this has become part of athletic performance training, which seems to be, at least looking at some of the dialogues that go on in such things, it is a not neurological, but an intentional, a deliberate talking to oneself. What does it actually mean to talk to oneself intentionally? Say, come on, you can make that last lap around the track. There are already mental processes that we have that are part of our ordinary experience that don't need a neurological explanation at all.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area of research that it's been quite exciting for me to be able to link together the way that people were talking about inner speech and self-talk in various different domains that had previously been kept quite separate. So my approach is, well, initially it was as a developmental psychologist. I was interested in how children start to use words to regulate their own behaviour and how ultimately that develops into inner speech. But there's all this research going on in this other area of psychology on self-talk, which, as you say, that there's a huge amount of published research now on every sport, from badminton to archery to you name it. There's a study on darts playing.
Really?
Just about every sport you can imagine has been studied in relation to self-talk, because it turns out if you talk to sports people, it's very important to a lot of people. It's very useful. It's a really big part of their performance and their sort of coaching and their self-coaching. So it's a good thing to study. There are interesting connections that you can make, and we are talking basically about the same thing. The only thing I would say is that in terms of how this research has been done, in self-talk, there usually hasn't been too much of a distinction drawn between external self-talk, talking to yourself out loud, or what we would call private speech, and internal self-talk. So often the studies that are conducted don't draw that distinction, which I think is quite an important distinction to draw, and I think that might change as the field evolves. But another aspect of sports self-talk that's really useful is that it emphasises that talking to yourself is not just about giving yourself instructions and planning your behaviour. That's a big part of why we use inner speech and private speech, but it's not the only part. And what you see with sports people is that they're doing something else a lot of the time, and that is they're using language to motivate themselves, as you've mentioned, to tell themselves off, to G themselves up, to give themselves a ticking off if they do something dumb, to regulate their emotions and their motivation as much as thinking through a kind of cognitive challenge. And the sports self-talk work really shows the variety of different functions that we put language to when we direct it at ourselves. So language is this extraordinary phenomenon that can do so many different things. It has so many different functions. And all of those functions really apply to private speech, inner speech, self-talk. You can use language to plan, to think things through, to solve puzzles, but you can also use it to regulate your emotions, to cheer yourself up, to tell yourself off, to motivate yourself. Even it's been postulated to have a role in the kind of construction of a narrative self, the way in which we tell a story about our experience, and sense of ourselves as entities, even that seems to be connected to our use of inner speech and private speech.
You're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today with Charles Fernyhough, Fernyhough, PhD, about his book, The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves, and the Science of Inner Speech and Hearing Voices. There's an author who I think you mentioned, Timothy Wilson, who actually we interviewed on a couple of years ago about his book called Redirect, the surprising new science of psychological change. But his core concept in that book and the work that he's done, or at least some of the work that he's done, has to do with that issue of an internal narrative that we have. And one of the things that was provocative for me about reading your book had to do with how is inner speech, how we talk to ourselves, part of that narrative, and how is it part of both establishing it and creating it. I'm trained as a social scientist, so I'm always wondering, yes, the psychological aspect itself, the construction of the self is interesting and fascinating, but also ourselves are social. We are social beings, and how does that construction of myself happen in the context of how I interact with other people?
Yeah, you make two really important, at least two really important points just there. There's a point about the sort of continuity of the self, that narrative that we tell, and then there's a point about the social origins of inner speech. So maybe I can just sort of comment on each of them.
Yes, please.
In terms of the narrative self, I think this is one of the main things that inner speech does for us, those of us who use it, which is probably most of us. It helps us to tell a story. It helps us to knit together our experience into a narrative that makes sense to us. It allows us to pull together the many varied kinds of information and experience that float through our minds. Everything from memories to imagination to visual perceptions to sounds and smells and so on. I think language helps us to knit all that together. So I use the metaphor in The Voices Within of imagine a necklace and the thread of the necklace that holds all those beads together. And inner speech is that thread. And there isn't a huge amount of empirical evidence to support this, but there are some interesting snippets of research. So a researcher called Alain Morin in Canada has shown that people who use more self-talk basically have a more fully developed sense of their own self, fitting with the idea that we use language to spin this kind of web of the self. Another bit of evidence comes from people with aphasia who lose their language ability, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. And there are case studies of people who, having temporarily lost their ability to use language in any way, and usually that has implications for using language directed at the self, that coincides with a kind of loss of the sense of self, a loss of awareness of who one is for the period of time that you don't have the language. And I think that fits with a lot of what we know about the role that language plays in our psychology. As far as the social origin aspect is concerned, this is really where I came into this topic. I was inspired by the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who flourished in the 1920s and 30s before a very sad, untimely death. And Vygotsky's real insight was to say that this language that's in our heads, it comes from somewhere. And it comes from the same kind of language uses that we use externally. So the kind of conversation that you and I are having, that kind of dialogue between two different social perspectives, two different positions, gets turned into, over the course of development, becomes internalized to become this inner monologue or this inner dialogue that we call inner speech. And there are some really important implications of that. So one is that the inner speech that you do in your head when you're, waiting for the bus or walking to work or chopping vegetables in the kitchen, that inner speech isn't actually a monologue. It is a dialogue. You are having a conversation with yourself that has a social structure, social patterning.
Yes.
And that's really the kind of starting point for me for all of this, because if that's true, that means that inner speech should have certain really interesting, important properties.
One of the things that I found interesting about your writing about this issue is to bring in the issue of how inner speech, other voices, internal voices, plays a role in particularly writing, because I know you write fiction as well as the research you do. What it brought up for me was I studied acting for some time. In a class that was on acting Shakespeare, the instructor asked the question, what are all these monologues about? Now was the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. We know in terms of the drama why that's going on. The audience is being informed, is being told part of the story, but why is the character stopping and talking out loud to the audience? And the answer she gave was that it's because there's so much going on inside that it has to come out. I wonder if that makes sense in terms of the internal dialogue. I notice myself, my internal speech gets much busier when I'm stimulated in one way or another, either positively or negatively. That one of the things that is behind inner speech is there's just a lot going on inside, and it needs to come out. Does that make sense in terms of work that you've done?
I think so. I think putting it into words gives us a kind of handle on our thoughts. As soon as you put it into words, whether you're saying those words out loud to yourself or silently to yourself, they're kind of out there in the world as something that can be responded to. And so your inner dialogue likely takes this sort of dialogic conversational structure where you say something and then you comment on that thing. I mean, Hamlet's doing that in his famous soliloquy.
Yes.
Or not to be, that is the question. He's answering himself. And we see this throughout, everything we learn about inner speech suggests that at least some of it involves this dialogic give and take. And we also see it in children's private speech, which is the thing that Vygotsky argued turns into inner speech. So it fits totally for me that with the idea that we use language to work stuff out. It's easy. It just gives us something to grip onto. If you say something, if you put something out there, you can kind of listen into it and respond to it in a way that if you keep everything totally abstract, I think it's just a bit harder to do. But having said that, we must always keep remembering variability. People are different. Some people don't in speech. Very, very clever people, have said they solve these mathematical problems without using any language at all. So we have different. I'm pragmatic about this. We do stuff that makes things easier for us. We don't do it because it absolutely has to be done. We do it just because it helps, because it's useful to do. And thinking about why it's useful I think is very interesting.
There was a book written in the early 50s called How to Do Things with Words by a British philosopher named J.L. Austin. And that book his work has had a significant impact both in philosophy but also in a broad range of the humanities. What he introduces a discussion of literally how we do things with words other than pass information back and forth. What it brings up for me is not only are we doing things with each other, but when we have internal speech, we're doing something. We are presumably trying to affect ourselves, which brings me back to an acting exercise, which was, memorize some lines and pick a partner, and using those lines, get your acting partner to do something. After all, is why you're on the stage. You're not giving directions on how to get to the museum. What kinds of things are we doing when we are engaged in internal speech? And related to that, to the point you were just making, that it doesn't manifest in everyone as speech, but does it manifest, or is there evidence that this kind of process manifests itself in other ways, in other forms other than speech, that we are affecting our own behavior or our own actions?
Yes, it's interesting that you mention Austin's book. I think speech act theory, as we now call it, is a really interesting way of making sense of what language does in this respect. I mean, I mentioned already that, language has all these different functions, and I think speech acts is just a way of helping us to understand that.
Yes.
We are using language initially in development, according to Vygotsky, we're using language to affect someone else. So a child might use words to get mum to pass the cookie, or to do something like that, and vice versa. Mum will use a word to get the child to do something. So children learn that language can affect other people's behaviour, and it's from there. It's a simple matter of kind of turning the words back on themselves, turning the words back on their own source, so that you can now start using words to affect the self, to give the self instructions and to tell the self off, and all those different things that we've talked about. So yeah, and I think thinking about the pragmatic functions of language, that's another way of expressing this. What are we doing with words? What is the functions? What are the varied functions of language? Is an approach that is really bearing fruit. Thinking about inner speech as something that potentially has these different functions, and using ideas from linguistics and pragmatics and philosophy of language and so on to expand our understanding of how all this works.
I have to say that one of the moving parts of your book is your discussion of those developmental issues. Having children myself, it takes me back to recognizing what is going on when the child is playing with dolls and they're taking the part. They're directing things, or that they're scolding themselves for something they've done, or that they're praising themselves for something they've done, or they're just describing what it is that they're doing and what they intend to do. What just came through my mind was the extent to which, the first time that I came across your work, there was a reference in passing to how people use inner speech as a way of rehearsing, and how watching a child use talking to themselves is the precursor, but is a clue as to what's going on when they internalize that. So I have to say that that part of your book moved me very much. What I wanted to loop back on is the idea of the unitary self, which you said that your work calls into question. What I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, you've already discussed it some, is what this work on inner voices does to challenge the idea of a unitary self, but from, call it a practical standpoint, from the standpoint of understanding who we are and how to be in the world, what, call it opportunities, does that challenge to the unitary self bring, and what problems does it create?
Well, I think if you get started with the Vygotsky's theory about how inner speech develops, then you can't get away from the fact that the self is social, that our thinking is social, that when a person alone in a room is thinking something through, they are actually an orchestra, they're a chorus, they are a conversation of, among different perspectives, all being articulated in one person's head. And that's tremendously exciting and liberating, and it helps to explain so many different things, but it's also really problematic for our Anglo philosophy of mind, which is just that we are one center. We are, Descartes' single epistemic center, the single mind making sense of stuff. And then, what flows from that is the idea that if there's inner speech, it's just the outpourings of a one mind, just churning stuff out. And I think sometimes inner speech is like that, but I think more of the time we are many, we are multiple, we are the self in conversation with the self, we are the self in conversation with someone else in inner speech. And I didn't actually respond properly to your point about prayer and speaking to God, but, one way of understanding prayer in this respect is to think of it being an internal conversation with God or with a spiritual being of some kind. So all the way through, we're multiple. We're holding different perspectives. We're playing different perspectives off against each other. And that fits nicely with all sorts of new understandings of how the mind works neuroscientifically, that it is not just a single processing entity. It's actually a whole bunch of different competing processes that are doing their own thing. It makes sense of ideas about dissociation, for example, as resulting from psychic trauma and leading to various kinds of mental health difficulties. It's liberating, but it's also bracing, because it requires us to throw away some of our really deeply embedded philosophy, or at least to rethink it. So, one of the criticisms of my work on dialogic inner speech has been how does it make sense for the self to tell the self something it doesn't already know? And I think it does. I think the problem is we need to rethink our understanding of the self and rethink some of the tenets of the philosophy of mind that we have that we've got so attached to.
I'm going to take a brief musical break. When I come back, I'll continue talking with Charles Fernyhough about inner speech, hearing voices, and his book, The Voices Within. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. You're in the right place. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. Our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, has more information about this show as well as our almost 700 other shows, a free download of today's show, free open access to recordings of all our shows, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. I'm talking today with Charles Fernyhough, Fernyhough, about his book, The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves. Information about the interdisciplinary project he leads, Hearing the Voices, is at hearingthevoices.org. Hearing the Voices is all one word. Information about the peer-to-peer Hearing Voices movement, or network, is at intervoiceonline.org. Intervoiceonline, all one word, .org. There is a mode of therapy by a physician, American physician named Martin Rossman, that is called guided imagery. And without going into significant detail, the actual practice of the therapy is to guide or talk someone, a patient or a client, to imagine being in a place that's safe and comfortable, and then to imagine an advisor, and then have a dialogue with that advisor. And this actually sometimes takes the form of, if you have a disease or an illness, you call up that illness, and the illness appears as something, a character, and you have a dialogue with it, or you have with this advisor. What your work points to is that indeed we are talking to ourselves, and there's even a form of dream therapy that talks about how really all the characters in your dreams are different aspects, so to speak, of you, and that you are talking to yourself. So in a quite practical sense, we are certainly capable of imagining having dialogues with characters, and in that context, I can easily imagine that I'm having a dialogue with different aspects or different, I'm going to call them roles. Does it make sense that the voices would manifest themselves in that way as well, and that when we are engaged in this kind of activity, that kind of imagining, that we are in fact talking to ourselves, and that is quite easy to imagine because here we are doing it and taking ourselves into that realm.
Yeah, that resonates with me in all sorts of ways. I mean, one of the nice responses to my book has been from people who say that it really makes sense to them in terms of a particular therapy that uses similar kind of dialogic principles or dynamic principles, family systems and voice dialoguing, and all sorts of therapeutic approaches basically are founded on the idea that the self is multiple, the self can take different positions. I think it's a bit too limiting to say it's always about roles. I think it can be about adopting roles. There's been some interesting work from Poland on the kinds of voices or roles that seem to crop up quite commonly in people's inner speech. And that is important, but I think there's something at a deeper level of just the way our minds are structured, that they run in this dialogic sense, with this dialogic structure, and what can occupy the different positions in that dialogic structure are all sorts of things. As I say, you can have a conversation with God, you can have a conversation with a dead parent, you can take on different roles of the self and put them into dialogue. You can have a conversation between yourself as in the role of a mother and yourself in the role of professional woman. That kind of thing is going on in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of people, a lot of the time. So that completely resonates for me, that as soon as we start seeing the self as multiple, that we see the mind as a dialogue rather than a monologue, things fall into place in interesting ways.
I imagine there is a variety of emotional reactions to recognition of this process. Oh, that's what that can mean, and it could be quite disturbing or it could be quite liberating. Oh, that's an aspect of me I hadn't realized I had. Or, oh dear, that's an aspect of me I didn't realize I had.
Yeah, not everybody would want to sort of bring it round to internal dialogue, and maybe that's just a particular emphasis that I have, but something similar is going on in many aspects of both typical mental functioning and things to do with psychiatric distress and disorder. So to give you an example of the latter, in terms of hearing voices, which I mentioned is a feature of people's experience in around 70% of cases of schizophrenia. But also hearing voices happens in a whole range of other disorders, everything from eating disorder to borderline personality disorder to post-traumatic stress disorder. And then beyond those who have psychiatric diagnoses, there are quite a few people who hear voices quite regularly and are not distressed in any way, who live quite comfortably with their voices and find them often instructive and useful and creative and so on. And then many people have, more low-level or one-off or fleeting voice-hearing experiences. We reckon somewhere between 5 and 15% of the population have report having these sorts of experiences at least once in their life. So that's just by way of giving a bit of background on the range of kinds of people who do hear voices. But in the last 25 years or so, there's been a really important sort of social movement away from pathologizing hearing voices. It's called the Hearing Voices Movement. It's a worldwide phenomenon now. And one of the things that it that at least some adherents of the approach will say is that there is a process of coming to terms with one's voices, of entering into a new relationship with one's voices. And it is a broad church. It contains many different perspectives and views. But one common way of people understanding this is to say that they started off finding their voices alien, finding their voices different to the self, not being able to reconcile the voice with the self, partly because often the voice was saying horrible things, or occasionally giving commands to do bad things. But through the process of recovery and working through the sort of process of the Hearing Voices movement, there becomes a recognition that those different voices are actually parts of the self. They're fragments of the self. They're bits of the self that have been pushed out, bits of the self that have been hurt, that have been traumatized. It's a very strong connection between hearing voices and childhood abuse. That doesn't mean that everybody who hears voices was abused, but there is a strong association. And people have really been able to make sense of this in terms of dissociation, which is the term we give to the self, kind of sort of fragmenting, taking on different sort of breaking up as a result of trauma. And the process of recovery then becomes being about recognizing the parts of one's own self and bringing them together and allowing them to coexist. Not always comfortably. It can still be distressing, it can still be problematic, but there's a kind of ownership of a new relationship with these different aspects of the self. And to me, that's another way of thinking about voices in internal dialogue.
Is this the focus of the interdisciplinary project you lead, the name of which I have completely forgotten, I'm ashamed to say?
We have a project called Hearing the Voice, which runs at Durham University in the UK and is funded by the Wellcome Trust. And really this project stemmed from an understanding that hearing voices is a varied, complex experience that happens to a lot of people in many different walks of life and has always done so right across history and across cultures. Hearing voices is there. There are these interesting parallels with ordinary inner speech, with spiritual revelation, with creative processes.
Yes.
The only way to try and bring all that together and make sense of it was to look at it in the round, to take this sort of 360-degree approach and say, let's look at this experience not just from the perspective of neuroscience and psychology, but from the perspective of theology, from philosophy, from linguistics, from medical humanities, from literature, from medieval history, from really whatever works, wherever there is something interesting and important to say about this experience, let's bring these different disciplines together and try and come at it from all these different angles. So we have psychiatrists and clinical psychologists involved, but we also have theologians and literary scholars and anthropologists and a very wide range of disciplines, all kind of thinking about the same problem in all its richness and complexity.
If the thing that inner speech is doing manifests itself in other forms, if it isn't speech, but would be even not necessarily sound, and this will sound a little odd, but I think you raised the issue of what the relationship is between inner speech and thinking. That we ponder things, we stop and we let things come to us. From that we get a sense, and very often it's a sense of ourselves, but it's a sense of where we are and a sense of what to do next. So the focus on speech is because we are speaking creatures. A lot of who we are and what we do is a result of how we talk, of talking. But there are other aspects to what we do affect us. I wonder if you have looked at, or there are researchers who are looking at other modes of internal communication that do something like what inner speech is doing, or serve the kinds of purposes that inner speech serves for us and our sense of ourselves.
Yeah, I think this goes right back to what I said at the beginning, which is not everybody does it. I've worked with people who think much more visually. They think in terms of images and patterns fitting together, and that they don't use language very much at all. Not everybody uses language, and there have to be different ways to achieve the same ends. But as you say, language is pretty important to a lot of us, and it does all these useful things. So it's not really a surprise that we use it for what it's good at. As far as music's concerned, we're just starting to do research now on what we call inner music, sort of on an analogy with inner speech. When I was young and I was convinced I was going to be a rock star, I didn't have any.
Weren't we all?
I just had this constant inner music. There's this music going on the whole time. It wasn't a musical hallucination because I knew it was coming from me. But there are these interesting parallels. I mean, you can ask the question, is on an analogy with inner speech and hearing voices, are musical hallucinations the same kind of misattribution of one's own inner music? We haven't got very far with exploring that scientifically yet, but it's an interesting hypothesis for the future. So I think our minds are incredibly varied, and I wouldn't be surprised to come across somebody who didn't use speech at all internally, who thought completely in music. All of these, there's space for the wonderful variety. So it doesn't surprise me that you come across all these different ways of being, of having experience. Some people use language a lot because language is useful in all these ways, and language is something that is very important to a lot of us. But it's not the only thing out there, and I wouldn't be surprised to come across somebody who only used visual images to do their thinking, to somebody who only had music going on. I think they'd be less common to find those patterns, but there's space for the wonderful richness and variety of humanity.
You're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today with Charles Fernyhough, Fernyhough, PhD, about his book, The Voices Within. I did some research into the importance of body language. So it makes me wonder what the connection is, or how imagination of physical presence is a part of this experience of inner voices. I know that myself, if I'm talking to myself about how I'm going to do something, I'll suddenly realize that I'm doing gestures appropriate to whatever it is that I happen to be talking about. So, as I said, I wonder how much you're looking at not only the verbal part of speech, but the body part of speech. Is that part of the picture here of what goes on with people, that they're not only hearing, imagining voices, but there's a physical dimension to this that they are either imagining or actually manifesting?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think a criticism of this approach is to say it's too much about language, it's too kind of in the head, and it's not sufficiently cognizant of the embodied nature of our cognition. But I think that's probably true, but I think it can become so. I think the work just needs to develop in those areas. And I think it's sort of in there already. So not all language works in words. Deaf people, for example, use language to communicate, but they also use sign language to communicate with themselves. I mean, we're talking about something that has the formal structure of a language.
Yes.
But here, it is something that is about bodily movement. That is the medium through which the language operates. And then at the other end of the scale, I think when babies get going with dialogue, they're doing it not in a linguistic way. They're doing it in pre-linguistic dialogue through gesture, through conversations of smiles and gesture and so on, or of babbling that doesn't really have any semantic content, but is a kind of foothold into having a dialogue with another mind. And then when language comes along, boom, something really powerful happens, and those sort of proto-dialogues take on a properly linguistic form for most kids, at least. So I think that is an interesting, important way in which this work can be developed further, for sure.
Is there any difference among cultures in terms of structures of language, the kinds of language that are more prone to inner dialogues than others that lend themselves to it, that the instrument itself is more adept than other instruments of language?
Yeah, unfortunately, we know next to nothing.
Yeah.
There should be all sorts of very, very interesting differences between language. When you think about the way certain languages are highly inflected and therefore telegraphic. Russian, which was Vygotsky's language, is one such language. Chinese is another language that offers very different sort of structural possibilities. We just haven't been able to do the research yet. There's a bit of research on what language people use for inner speech, those who use more than one language, and how it relates to language experience and when one language was acquired versus another, and so on. But I would love to know much more, including about how the structural properties of language give different affordances for inner speech. The highly compressed or inflected language might be really useful in certain contexts, but not others. And whether that pans out in terms of the languages that bilingual or multilingual people choose to use to do inner speech in different contexts would be really fascinating to find out. But we know almost nothing on that.
We're getting close to the end here, and one of the things I wanted to make sure that listeners heard about is there's a movement you mentioned, and then the organization or the project that you're leading in terms of what they might find there. And I'm particularly interested in the organization, the hearing. I'm sorry again, I forgot the name of and I didn't write it down. The organization or the movement of hearing voices. That's of particular interest, I would think.
Yeah, so the Hearing Voices movement, as I say, is a worldwide movement. You'll find branches of it in every nation, and it's relatively easy to track down local hearing voices groups, and these are groups that are run by people who hear voices and have other unusual experiences. There are no doctors, no psychiatrists, no health service workers there. It is a completely sort of peer-led structure. So it's people who have these experiences getting together to own them, to reclaim them, to talk about them. And many people find these very, very useful if there is distress about hearing voices. So, and the international kind of body that oversees all of the Hearing Voices movement groups around the world is called Intervoice, and if you just Google that, you'll find their site, which will point you to the various national Hearing Voices movements wherever you are.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of support out there. There will be a Hearing Voices group nearby. It's highly likely. In terms of our project Hearing the Voice, they do sound a bit similar, but they are distinct projects. We also, on our website, hearingthevoice.org, we have some useful sort of FAQs, frequently asked questions about hearing voices, and they can be downloaded. We even have a version in British Sign Language. So there's information out there. So people who are affected and know somebody who's distressed, or if they're distressed themselves, there is plenty of support out there and information.
And finally, since those organizations, although I assume they aren't exclusively focused on clinical situations, but the more ordinary, other than reading your book, of people who want to use their inner voices productively. That's not quite the right way. Use their inner voices creatively. Use their inner voices positively, just as a normal part of life. Are there any organizations that work with that? Or how would someone go about finding out more on how to do that, how to work with those voices?
Yeah, there isn't that much actually in that respect. We're running a study as part of Hearing the Voice called Writers' Inner Voices, where over the course of a few years we've been interviewing in depth and surveying professional writers about how they work with the voices of their characters. And that we have a sort of separate blog on that project. But I don't know if there's any sort of more general approach to using one's voices more productively. What I haven't tried to do is write a self-help book, really. It's more of an information exploration book. It's not really telling people how to do it. You don't get the kind of top 10 tips at the end of each chapter.
Oh, no.
For such a book to be written, but it didn't really interest me.
Oh, well, it's a brilliant book.
Well, thank you.
It was well written. It was engaging, and it was very eye-opening. So, your book stands on its own, and I recommend it highly to anyone who is intrigued at all by this issue. What I was thinking more of is the organization, the movement, that form of peer-to-peer group therapy, one might say. That's one name for it. But it's people talking to each other about their condition and figuring out how to live with it. Whether the condition doesn't mean a bad thing. It just means these are my circumstances. How do I make a good life? How do I make a better life? How does this help us lead a better life, as Wittgenstein asked? And that was the kind of thing that I was curious about. Are there others who are peers where one can find peers to talk about this?
Well, in terms of creativity and so on, there isn't really that much out there as far as I know, and I'm sure I'm missing some things. But the Hearing Voices movement, as you say, is a really peer support groups for people who have the experience, who often have found a new way of understanding and relating to their voices that they then can help people who are more distressed. So it's, as I say, it's a worldwide phenomenon, and many people find it of great help.
I'm afraid we are out of time. Charles Fernyhough, I really appreciate your time, and I very much appreciate the work that you've done and your book, The Voices Within.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's been really good to talk to you, and thank you for having me on the show.
You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, for information about this show and almost 700 other shows. Free access to recordings of all of them, a free newsletter about upcoming shows, and more. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Lena Berman and Jeffrey Fawcett. Until next time, take care of yourself.
President Trump delivers his State of the Union address a week late on Tuesday. Trump is expected to make the case for his border wall.
You can never have border security unless you have a steel barrier, a concrete wall.
The Democratic response by former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams.
And silence is a weapon for those who would quiet the voices of the people.
and our panel on what it all means. Mitch Jeserich will host. Tuesday, February 4th, beginning at 6 on KPFA 94.1 and kpfa.org.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248VR in Santa Cruz, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.